In this video, we're going to look at the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, if you're thinking, what does that mean? Well, let me just tell you that the transatlantic slave trade was one of the most significant events in world history. It forever changed the demographics of both the Western Hemisphere and the continent of Africa. But why did it start? Let's get into it. So the story begins back in the early 15th century, when Europeans began exploring the coast of Africa. Oh, you might be asking, well, wait a minute. Wasn't Africa a massive continent full of vast empires such as Songhai, the Inca Empire, the Zulu Kingdom, the Kingdom of Congo, and many others? Well, yes, it was. But those empires and kingdoms were not on the coast of Africa, and the Europeans had no idea that they even existed. I mean, remember, these Europeans were guys like the Portuguese and the Spanish, and they were still figuring out exactly what the heck was going on out in the world. In fact, they didn't even know the Earth was round yet. So the only part of Africa they knew about was the small slice along its northwest coast. And that's where they focused their attention. So why were these Europeans even looking to explore Africa anyway? Well, there were three main reasons. First, they were looking for gold. I mean, remember, this is coming off the heels of the Crusades, and Europe had become pretty wealthy thanks to the riches of the Middle East. They wanted to find new sources of gold to replace the expensive and difficult to acquire sources from Asia. Second, they wanted to find a faster route to Asia. This is because the Silk Road had become quite dangerous, and Europeans merchants were getting fed up with having to travel through the Middle East. Finally, third, there was a strong religious component to European exploration. Both the Portuguese and Spanish were devout Catholics who were eager to spread Christianity to every corner of the globe. They honestly believed it was their God-given duty to convert everyone to Christianity, and that included Africa. As the Portuguese began exploring the west coast of Africa during the 1400s, they quickly found that the region was perfect for establishing trading posts. First, there were tons of local rulers eager to do business with the Europeans. See, the people living along the coast of Africa in the 1400s were not part of any large empire. Instead, they were made up of hundreds of small kingdoms and chieftains, each vying for power over the other. The Portuguese were able to take advantage of these rivalries by playing them against each other and making deals for land. In fact, the Portuguese king even created honorary titles such as the Lord of the Most to reward local rulers for helping them establish forts and trading posts along the coast. Second, the climate of the region was perfectly suited for growing sugar, which would prove to be an extremely profitable crop. Finally, third, the region's relative emptiness was perfect for building settlements, since Europeans could easily claim large tracts of land with very few people living there. But as the Portuguese began exploring farther down the coast, things started to change. Eventually, they came upon the great empires and kingdoms of Africa, but also started to notice another thing. Along the coast, there weren't enough people to build settlements or work the plantations. So the Portuguese were forced to venture inland to find workers. And when they did this, they found plenty of people, but they were not willing to enslave them. Instead, the Portuguese offered these Africans a choice. Either come and work for us on the plantations, or stay home and pay taxes to your kingdom. And for the most part, this system worked. But as time went on, Africans grew tired of being exploited by the Europeans and rebelled. But the Europeans needed workers and were not deterred. So they went back to Africa to try and find some other way to get people to work for them. And that's when they hatched a plan so diabolical it has become synonymous with human cruelty, slavery. At first, the Portuguese used force to kidnap as many people as possible. But then, they realized there was a better way. If they simply bribed local African leaders, they could purchase people much easier. And once they had enough people, all they had to do was sail across the Atlantic and drop them off on one of their plantations in the New World. And that is how the slave trade began. And before long, the Portuguese had it running like a well-oiled machine. Their system was actually quite simple. Ships would leave Portugal for Africa carrying manufactured goods, wine and textiles, gold and silver and ivory and walrus. These items would then be traded to local African leaders in exchange for prisoners taken from recent military campaigns or for captives bought from other local leaders who had raided neighboring villages. So once they had as many captives as they could carry, the ships would set sail for the Americas, where the captives would be sold to European colonists who ran plantations. The colonists would then use the labor of these newly acquired slaves to grow cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton. These crops were chosen specifically because they required a lot of labor to harvest, but were highly profitable once sold in Europe. The slaves would work from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, and were forbidden from learning to read or write.
Ow.
They were also prohibited from gathering in large numbers, carrying sharp objects, or even walking more than 5 miles away from the plantation without permission. Slaves who broke the rules were often beaten severely or sold away to another plantation. Now, when most people think of the Atlantic slave trade, their minds immediately go to the 18th and 19th centuries, specifically to places like Brazil and the Caribbean where so many Africans were transported under horrific conditions to work on plantations. But what most people don't realize is that this system of slave trade actually started about 100 years before that. In fact, there were even more Europeans involved back then than there would be later. And there was also a lot more African involvement too. So, in today's video, we are going to explore how the transatlantic slave trade got its start during the 16th century. Alright, so before we get into it, let me just say that I am by no means trying to downplay the role of Europeans in this horrific enterprise. After all, they were the ones who created the demand for slaves in the first place. But the whole point of this series is to show how the modern world was made by people of African descent. And one of the ways we were able to do that is through understanding the slave trade from a more comprehensive perspective. Anyway, with that said, let's begin. Okay, so the first thing we need to talk about is how the trade expanded after the 16th century. See, up until the 16th century, only the Portuguese were heavily involved in the slave trade. They had been transporting slaves from the Congo region to places like Brazil since the early 1500s. However, after the 16th century, more European nations started to get involved. England, France, and the Netherlands became major players in the slave trade, although the Portuguese would remain the biggest slave traders overall. So now, let's talk about African involvement. A common misconception is that the Europeans went into Africa and captured the slaves themselves. While this did happen on occasion, especially in regions like East Africa, the majority of slaves were actually captured by African kingdoms and traders, who then sold them to European traders. Now, some scholars argue that this is proof that Africans were somehow complicit in their own enslavement, but the reality is a lot more complicated than that. The fact of the matter is that African kingdoms and traders were simply taking advantage of an opportunity to acquire new wealth. See, at the time, Africa was not a monolith. It was divided into hundreds of different states and kingdoms, some of which were well developed with advanced political systems and technologies. For example, the Kingdom of Congo had a sophisticated bureaucracy and well-paved roads. On top of this, they had iron foundries that produced some of the best metalwork in Africa. There was also the Kingdom of Benin, which was known for its impressive art and architecture. The kingdom's capital city was a huge urban center, with large palaces and over 2 million inhabitants. Then there was the Kingdom of Oyo, which had a standing army that was equipped with guns. These kingdoms were well aware of the power that the Europeans possessed, and they knew that if they wanted to compete with them, they needed to get ahead. In fact, African kingdoms had been trading with the Portuguese since the 15th century, exchanging things like gold, ivory, and textiles for European goods like beads, brandy, and guns. This trade initially benefited the Africans because they had a higher demand for European goods than the Europeans had for African goods. However, by the 16th century, the situation had started to turn around. The Europeans had realized that the real wealth of Africa was not in its raw materials, but in its people. That's right. They began to realize that Africans could be bought and sold as property, and this would prove to be far more lucrative than any trade they could have imagined. At first, the African kingdoms resisted, but eventually they caved to the demand. They started to capture neighboring tribesmen and sell them as slaves to the highest bidder. Now, this caused a number of problems. First, it led to massive displacement of people. Entire communities were wiped out and forced to march through the infamous door of no return. Second, it sparked numerous wars between African kingdoms as each one tried to acquire more slaves to sell. Third, it undermined the power of the African kingdoms. By the end of the 17th century, there was such a shortage of people in Africa that European traders could basically dictate the price. But despite all these problems, the African kingdoms continued to participate in the slave trade. And that brings us to the Triangle Trade. The Triangle Trade was an economic system that connected 3 continents: Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The way it worked was that European ships would come to Africa loaded with manufactured goods, textiles, brandy, guns, etc. The Europeans would then exchange these goods for slaves who were captured and sold by the Africans. Then the ships would sail to the Americas and sell those slaves to the highest bidder. Once they had acquired enough money from the sale of slaves, they would buy more goods and start the process all over again. Let's take a look at how this worked in practice. Let's say you were an English merchant living in London in the 17th century. You want to get into the slave trade, so you load up a ship with some textiles, brandy, and guns, and set sail for West Africa. When you arrive, you find a local African king and offer him a deal. You will give him the textiles and the brandy in exchange for a certain number of slaves. The African king agrees and supplies you with the slaves. You then sail to the Caribbean and sell the slaves to a Spanish plantation owner in exchange for money. You use that money to buy more goods and sail back to Africa to start the process all over again. However, it wasn't always that simple. Sometimes the Europeans would actually go into Africa and capture the slaves themselves. This happened in places like East Africa, where the Europeans established forts and trading posts. From there, they would launch raids into the interior and capture slaves. In other cases, the Europeans would team up with African leaders and offer them guns and ammunition in exchange for slaves. But regardless of how the slaves were acquired, they were almost always transported to the Americas. At its peak, the triangle trade was a highly lucrative business. European merchants could make fortunes by buying and selling slaves. African kingdoms could acquire vast quantities of wealth, and American plantations could acquire a cheap and plentiful supply of labor. Everyone seemed to be winning, right? Well, yes and no. For the Europeans and the Africans who were directly involved in the trade, yes, there was a lot of money to be made. But for the vast majority of Africans who were enslaved, there was nothing to gain. They were ripped away from their homes and forced to work under horrible conditions. Many died during the journey, or soon after arriving in the Americas. As horrible as it was, though, the transatlantic slave trade would last for another 2 centuries. In part 2 of this series, we will explore why that is and what ultimately led to its demise. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. Also, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you.